anyone joining us from outside the North Country. Thank you for joining us again for the third installment of the Black Experience in the Adirondacks, brought to you through the collaboration of the Adirondack Experience, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative in partnership with the Adirondack North Country Association. Tonight, we present part one of Driving While Black. I'm Nicky Hylton Patterson, Director of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, and I am honored to be here with Dr. Gretchen Sorin. Dr. Sorin is the Distinguished Professor and Director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program of the State University of New York. She has curated innumerable exhibits, including with the Smithsonian, the Jewish Museum, and the New York State Historical Association, and lives in upstate New York. Dr. Sorin writes and lectures frequently on museum practice, diversity and inclusion, and African American history. Her books include Touring Historic Harlem, 4 Walks in Northern Manhattan with architectural historian Andrew Dolkart, In the Spirit of Martin, The Living Legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the Smithsonian Institute Traveling Exhibition Service, Through the Eyes of Others, African Americans and Identity in the American Art, and Case Studies in Cultural Entrepreneurship, How to Create Relevant and Sustainable Institutions. She's the author of Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights. Sorin is also co-author and senior historian working with Steeplechase Films and filmmaker Rick Burns on a documentary film to be shown on PBS in 2020 by the same title. Dr. Sorin's book, Driving While Black, and here's a copy of it. Let me make sure that you're seeing it. Dr. Sorin's book here, Driving While Black, is on sale at the Adirondack Experience website, and we'll put up a link to the website for you in the chat box. And so some housekeeping for our audience this evening. If you would like to submit a question during this program, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll have a discussion. I will be discussing Dr. Sorin's book for 35 minutes, and then we'll open it for Q&A. You will only be able to see your own questions though. For questions that are not addressed this evening, ADI will add more information to its website along with a link to a recording of this evening's discussion, but that won't get done or won't get posted until next week, Monday. If you are having any trouble during this live stream, please feel free to post the question to the Q&A and a staff person will provide guidance. So just a little bit about Driving While Black, which I think is a very, very extraordinarily timely. And so we will hear most of the conversation from Dr. Sorin. But in Driving While Black, Dr. Sorin reveals how the car, the ultimate symbol of independence and possibility, has always held particular importance for African Americans, allowing Black families to evade the many dangers presented by an entrenched racist society and to enjoy, in some measure, the freedom of the open road. In Driving While Black, she recounts the creation of a parallel, unseen world of Black motorists who relied on travel guides, Black-only businesses, and informal communications networks to keep them safe. From coast to coast, mom and pop guest houses, tourist houses, beauty parlors, including New York's Hotel Teresa and the Hampton House in Miami. As Sorin demonstrates in the book, Black travel guides and Black-only businesses encouraged a new way of resisting oppression. Black Americans could be confident of finding welcoming establishments as they traveled for vacation or for business. Civil rights workers learned where to stay and where to eat in the South between marches and protests. As Driving While Black reminds us, the civil rights movement was just that, a movement of people and their allies in defiance of local law and custom. At the same time, Dr. Sorin shows in the book that the car, despite the freedoms it offered, brought Black people up against new challenges, from segregated ambulance services to unwarranted traffic stops and the racist violence that too often followed. Interwoven and beautifully done, I really enjoyed reading this book, was Dr. Sorin's own family history, and enhanced by dozens of little known photo images. And I encourage you to read this book because it's very, very well researched and well done. And we get a sort of a bird's eye view, a peek into how much of Dr. Sorin's own background and family life is intertwined in the Driving While Black, in the experiences of Black Americans, African Americans who had access to automobiles and what that meant. So Driving While Black charts how the automobile fundamentally reshaped African American life and opens up an entirely new onto one of the most important issues of our time. Now, Dr. Sorin uses the story of Victor and Alma Green's famous Green Book, a travel guide that begun in 1936, as her doorway into narrating the story. And it helped grant Black Americans, how the Green Book helped grant Black Americans that most basic American right, the family vacation. So this book exists at the intersection of race, class, and the freedom to move. Mobility for Black people in America. Dr. Sorin, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Please call me Gretchen.
What was that, Gretchen? Thank you for being with us. I really enjoyed this book, and I kept underlining and thinking about the many, many instances, all the way from antebellum America, all the way through to the epilogue, where you talk about what you're telling your 16-year-old son, and we'll get to that, about how to stay safe while driving while Black, those hidden codes for survival. And so I want to ask you at the onset, what was the impetus and what was the creative process and the research process in writing this book?
Well, I started this book after doing an exhibition on African American history in Saratoga Springs, actually. And I was working with a colleague who asked me if I had ever heard of the Negro Motorist Green Book, and I had never heard of it. But I was intrigued and wanted to learn more. So this was probably about 26 or so years ago. And, you know, she had just a cover of the Green Book, and I wanted to know more about it. So I started to do research, and this is long before anybody started thinking about the Green Book as an important document. As I dug in deeper into the Green Book, I realized that it was starting to explain a lot of things to me about my parents' behavior. You know, why when we traveled, they never stopped any place. They never stopped at a restaurant. They never stopped at a hotel when we were traveling back to my grandmother's home in North Carolina. And I wondered about that. And this started to make sense to me that driving while Black was a really dangerous undertaking, especially in the Jim Crow period, because you didn't know where you could stop. You didn't know what communities would be safe. And so African American families didn't stop. They loaded up their cars with everything they would need, and they just kept on driving. And as a child, I thought that was a little bit peculiar. But the more I did the research, the more I understood their behavior. And then I realized it was part of my own experience, my own story.
Right. Thank you. So you begin really talking about the antebellum South, right?
Yes.
And I often, when I talk about here in the Adirondacks, I get the question, why don't more Black people, why don't more people of color come to the Adirondacks from the southern parts of the state or from the other places in the country? And I always go back to that we've always not had the freedom to move. The freedom of movement was never defined as freedom for Black bodies and Black people.
Right.
So can you talk to me about that?
Mobility, I think, understanding African American mobility is really essential. So in the beginning, right, during enslavement, African Americans did not have the freedom to move about. You had to have a pass, or you had to wear a slave tag that showed where you were supposed to be. You couldn't travel without permission. And that becomes something that's policed, right? The beginning of our police departments, many of the police departments begin as slave catchers. They are community residents who gather together, and their job is to go out in the evening and look for fugitive slaves and to intimidate fugitive slaves and keep them from rebelling. So that actually becomes the foundation of many of the early police departments. But mobility is restricted for African Americans from the beginning. And at first, of course, the slave catchers are legal, right? That was a legal thing to do, was to restrict slave mobility. After emancipation, that mobility is restricted by vigilante groups and by police officers in the South who are using their clubs and their guns to prevent African Americans both from leaving the land and to control them, to make sure they're controlled. So mobility, once again, is restricted. I think when you think about rural areas and you think about the Adirondacks or the national parks, the state parks, I think that the national parks actually are now in a research project looking at why African Americans tend not to go to the national parks. And I think the reason is, first of all, there's no tradition of visiting the wilderness. And secondly, African Americans are afraid.
Yes.
They're afraid of going into the wilderness. You might encounter some crazy man with a gun. And that is, I remember when I was a kid, my father would take us camping, and we always went to one of the state forests in New Jersey. It was the Jenny Jump Forest, and it was patrolled. And we went there because it was patrolled. The campsites were patrolled at night, and my father had a rifle. He was a shooter. He had a permit for it, of course. He had a license for it, but he always carried that rifle in the car. I never knew why, because he never took it out. I think he was afraid.
Yes.
And I think it was there for protection.
Yeah.
In doing the research for this book, we asked people about going into wilderness areas, and they were afraid of white mobs and white people who might be dangerous.
And so this is a contemporary interviews.
This is contemporary. These are oral histories that I did.
Yes.
These oral histories asking, because the national parks were a place that, in Ken Burns' movie, he talks about national parks as America's best idea. Well, the national parks were open to everyone. Admission to the national parks is free and open to everyone. The problem is that all of the concessions in the parks were segregated. So when you went to a national park, you could get in the park. You might not be able to find a place to stay.
Right. So in the book, you talk a lot about this counterculture of movement.
Yes.
This entire Black culture of movement that also created out of necessity or provided opportunities for business for Black women, especially, who were able to, because of the segregation laws, Black people were not able to stay at places like the Hilton,
right,
those hotels. And so Black females would open boarding houses.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the major chains, the major hotel chains like Sheraton, Howard Johnson's, Hilton, were all segregated. And African Americans could not stay there when they traveled. But women found that they could make extra money by opening up a room or two in their homes and providing housing for people who were traveling. And this provided extra money for the family. And these are the first American bed and breakfasts.
Yeah.
These are the first places that Black people stayed. And they stayed there when they were on civil rights marches. They stayed there when they were traveling with their families.
So how did the Green Book catalog, the Negro Green Book catalog, those spaces as they were coming up? Was there any kind of coded language that was written so that the book, because I know you wrote about how the book was written so that it would be publishable. And that way it's not making it, what I look at is not making it too Black, but
right,
making it, yeah.
It's very middle class. Victor Green knew that he needed the support of white allies. So he never mentions segregation. He never mentions the problems that African Americans face when travel. He'll say things like, bring your Green Book with you. You may need it. Or, be careful and make sure you plan your trip thoroughly. But they never really talked specifically about segregation. But of course, all of the places that are listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book were segregated places that African Americans could stay. And they were things like women's homes, family homes, but also tourist homes and guest houses, and resorts, as well as large luxury hotels like the ones that you mentioned, the Hotel Teresa in New York, the Hampton House in Florida, in Miami, which, by the way, has just been restored as a site. Yes.
Yes, we need to do some work to find out about that now. So if they know the history and celebrate that history of their participation.
But it was also that, yes, African Americans felt comfortable going to these places, to Black resorts, to Black beaches, because they didn't know how they would be perceived or treated. And especially they didn't want their children to face the kind of humiliation that they faced. And that was one of the reasons that these Black-only businesses thrived, other than the fact that white businesses would not accept African Americans as guests.
Yes. I want to talk a little bit, because you spend quite a bit of time talking about the role of the automobile to the civil rights movement. And I think that is really important, especially now, but we just lost John Lewis, who was a youth leader for SNCC. And so
amazing human being.
Yeah, amazing human being, and he's gone home to be with the ancestors, right? He's with the ancestors now, watching over us. But could you talk a little bit about the importance of the automobile, even the Selma boycott, right?
Right.
And in the ways, the kinds of codes and actions that different people used to access movement.
I think the civil rights movement, I'm willing to say the civil rights movement couldn't have happened without the automobile. Because if you think about, first of all, think about the boycotts. And it wasn't just the Selma boycott, the Montgomery boycott, I mean, it was boycotts in other parts of the country as well. Martin Luther King, for the Montgomery bus boycott, purchased a fleet of cars, entire fleet. And they used those automobiles to take people to work. Now, people needed to get to work so they wouldn't lose their jobs. And without the buses, if they needed to boycott the buses, the only way to get to work was for somebody to drive them. So cabs, as well as this fleet of cars, and people with private cars picked up walkers and drove them to work so they would not lose their jobs. As a result, in Montgomery, they were able to bankrupt the bus company by cutting their ridership by 69%. That's enormous. Right.
Yes.
It's absolutely enormous.
Yeah.
The other reason automobiles, I think, were crucial was because you had civil rights workers, NAACP field secretaries, traveling all over the South, looking at lynchings, investigating lynchings, investigating the burning of churches, and most importantly, registering voters. So in order to register voters in a county, if you just think of the size of a county, right, you've got to have a car to drive all over that county in order to register voters. But they were also taking health care, and they were taking education, and they were taking food, and they were taking all kinds of supplies out to people in rural areas that needed it. And you needed a car to do that.
Yes.
So the automobile proves to be really crucial in the civil rights movement.
You talk about, and so you also mention in sort of the preamble to each chapter, it's your own personal story, right? And your family and the car, the automobile at the center of that. When we talk about for Black people in that era, in the 20th century, it wasn't just any car.
Right.
The car, the car had, and I was talking to you about that big old car that in Florida that my uncle had, just going from Miami to take his daughter to Tallahassee, Florida. And why that big car was needed, why this kind of sturdy branch so there was specific criteria for the car. It wasn't a nice sporty car. Talk to us about what you wrote.
And if you think about it, your automobile, the thing that you drive is really tied to your identity.
Yes.
And I think it's tied to everyone's identity. whether you drive a Subaru or a Ford or a Toyota, it's tied to your identity. For African Americans, this was particularly true. African Americans, first of all, wanted very large, safe cars. They were putting their children in these cars, and they wanted them to be safe. So they perceived a bigger, heavier car was a safer car. They also wanted something reliable. You want a reliable car because you don't want to break down in a white neighborhood where you might be subject to you get yourself into a really dangerous situation. And Lonnie Bunch told me, the secretary of the Smithsonian, told me a story about his being with his father and a car breaking down in a white neighborhood. And immediately he was surrounded by the police who wanted to know, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Not how can we help you with your car, but what are you two people doing in this neighborhood? So it's very important to have a reliable car. So African Americans also may end up sleeping in the car, right? Because you can't necessarily find a hotel to sleep in. So you carried pillows and blankets. You needed to carry all of your own food because you might not be able to stop at a restaurant. So my parents had one of those big, heavy green Coleman coolers, metal coolers. Those were huge. And you carried that cooler full of ice and full of your food. So if you might also carry water for the radiator and gasoline, an extra gallon or two of gasoline. So you've got all of this stuff that you needed to carry, as well as a large coffee can to pee in case you needed to stop. And of course, you couldn't necessarily stop at a gas station bathroom. Right. I can remember all my life, my grandmother, who was from the South, grew up in the South, she was born in the 19th century, wanted to carry a pea can in the car. And I thought it was disgusting. And what is she doing? And why would she do this? I didn't understand the history behind this and why Black families always carried this can in the car. So if you think about all the paraphernalia you needed to carry to travel, you needed a big, sturdy car. African Americans love Buicks. They love Buicks, big Buicks and big Oldsmobiles.
Right.
And you wanted a car that could outrun a mob if you needed to.
Yes.
An Oldsmobile 88 was popular because you put the accelerator down and that car just goes. So it was important to have a really large car. And the other issue, I think, is that African Americans were prohibited from buying houses, often by redlining of their communities, by collusion between realtors and banks and the federal government, which is an example of systemic racism.
Yes.
So if you can't buy a house, the next largest purchase that you put your disposable income into is a car. So African Americans could afford to buy larger, better cars, which becomes kind of a stereotype. White people would look at Black people that had a nice car and say, well, how can they afford that really nice car? Well, They can afford that really nice car because they can't buy a house. They can't put their money into a house. So maybe they could afford to buy a big fancy Buick, or like your relative, a Cadillac.
Now you talk about in the book, you said that African Americans traversing in the 20th century Jim Crow South and seeing all of these signs, the car had to be sturdy, so the mob couldn't tip it over. It also had to be reliable, but not only that, they were more afraid of being stopped by law enforcement because the connection to the law enforcement and people like the Klan was always so intricate, was always so vested. And so talk to us a little bit about that. And then we wanted to get into a little bit of the parallels to now, which haven't changed in some ways, but has in a lot.
I think African Americans were, I think everyone in the country is kind of subject to the kind of prevailing prejudices in the country.
Yes.
And certainly police officers are no different. And there are lots of good police officers, and there are other police officers who are not so good. Yes. And their perception was often that African Americans must be a criminal involved in some way in criminality, especially if they had a nice car. Right. The perception was if you were driving a nice car, well, perhaps you were a drug dealer, or perhaps you were involved in some kind of criminal activity. When perhaps you had a nice car because you couldn't buy a house, and so you could really step that car, the level of that car up. But there was a lot of concern that if you were African American, concern. Research shows that African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white Americans.
Right.
One of the reasons that African Americans chose to drive at night in the dark was because law enforcement couldn't see in the car and they were less likely to get stopped. And that was one of the things that I noticed about my parents. Whenever we would go on vacation, they would start at 3 a.m. when it was still dark. So you do find that African Americans were driving a lot at night. Yes. And one of the things that happened because they were driving at night was that there were more car accidents.
Yes.
And it was very dangerous if you were involved in a car accident because the hospitals were segregated. And if you were not near a Black hospital, you were in deep trouble if you were involved in a car accident. We do know that quite a few performers died as a result of, Bessie Smith, for example, as a result of not being able to be taken to a hospital because there was no Black hospital nearby when she was involved in a car accident, and her arm was almost severed. Yet no hospital would accept her, and she died from blood loss. And this happened again and again and again to African Americans who were involved in traffic accidents.
You did mention, you talk about a very famous person who could pass as white. And when he was taken to the white hospital, and then it was discovered that he was Black, he was taken out in the rain, right?
Walter White, Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP, very fair-skinned and had blue eyes.
Right.
Was often perceived as white and could pass as white. And his father was also very fair.
Yes.
And his father was hit by a car driven by a physician. And so the physician bundled him up and put him in his car and took him to the hospital, and they were treating him. But when his Black, dark-skinned son-in-law came looking for him, and they realized that this man, oh my goodness, this man is Black, they quickly shuffled him out of the white hospital in the rain and took him to this rat-infested place that was the Black wing of this hospital across the street where he died.
Right.
But it was very typical, they had no idea that he was even Black until a relative showed up. Otherwise, they would have treated him in the clean environment of the white hospital.
Right. In the book, you talk about Victor Green's hope for ultimate hope for the Green Book, right? And talked about travel. And you write that I learned that the indelible lesson, even though Jim Crow segregation that legally ended in 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, white Southerners still found ways to discriminate. But Alma and Victor Green believed that equal rights in the United States were truly fully achievable, and that travel will ultimately help defeat prejudice.
Yes, he believed that.
So what do you think about that statement now?
I think that he was a little on the idealistic side. I think that, there are a lot of good people in this country.
Yes.
And I think that in some ways, when people encounter other people and get to know them and meet them and understand them, they really, it really does help to defeat prejudice. Right? We all have prejudices, whether it's Black-white prejudice or, anti-Semitism or anti-gay prejudice. We all have prejudices. But when we meet people one-to-one, sometimes that helps to diffuse prejudices. And that was what Victor Green believed. That was his mantra, that travel is fatal to prejudice, or prejudice is fatal to travel. And he was sure that, if only people would get to know him and other African-American travelers, that there would be greater understanding.
Yes.
And, we've come a long way. This country, African-Americans have come a long way in this country, and you can find African American people in every aspect of American society, almost every aspect of American society, I guess. And that's a good thing, but there's still a tremendous amount, there are still a lot of African Americans who have not realized the success that middle-class African Americans have realized. And they are still facing systemic racism, that everyone is still facing, but they can't break out of those, of the place that they're in.
Okay, so you do mention the Adirondacks in talking about the anti-Semitism faced by the Jewish community during the 20th century, later part of the 20th century, and so talk to us a little bit about that.
When you mentioned that I worked on exhibitions, I did an exhibition at the Adirondack Museum on tuberculosis.
Yes.
And with Jackie Day, she was the director at that time, and it was a wonderful project. It was during the AIDS epidemic, and we, really discovered a lot of brochures and advertisements for Adirondack guest houses and tourist homes and places to stay that were very open in their anti-Semitism. I mean, they actually said, "No Jews, no dogs," written on the brochure, or they were decorated with swastikas. And, that was a clear indication of anti-Semitism in the Adirondacks in that time period. I don't think any place in the United States is immune from racism, but Jews were not wanted in the Adirondacks in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
Yes.
In many places.
So talk to us about the parallels to today. Obviously, when I came to this country, and I came when I was to live permanently when I was like 29, and when I went to, this was me going to undergrad when I was 29, and I got there and we were supposed to register. I was the non-traditional student with a driver's license already, and they had vans. So the African and Caribbean Students Union we went to conferences, and I was the only one with a license long enough to qualify to drive the school van. But before we did that, remember, I'm coming from Jamaica, right? So my context of the African American experience, especially driving while Black, is very limited. And they sat me down. Black women sat me down and told me what to do when I'm driving that van. They said, when the police stop you, put your hands outside of the car if you can, or on the wheels, right? If he asks you for any documents, ask to reach for them first. May I go in my purse? May I go in the glove compartment? And so immediately there was a sense of fear of driving in this country that I hadn't experienced in other places. But, and then at the end of the book, you talk about preparing your 16-year-old son to drive. Speak to us a little bit about that.
Well, I think that many police, when they stop someone who's African American, because they have been steeped in the prejudice of this country, they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified of that person who can be a perfectly innocuous, unarmed person, but they're terrified. And so that is how a lot of folks have gotten shot and killed. And in this country, Black parents still teach their children that when you're stopped by a police officer, there are certain rules that you had better observe if you want to live.
Yes.
Those rules include no sudden movements, keeping your hands on the wheel where the officer can see them. Don't reach for your license and registration unless you ask, putting the light on inside the car, making sure that you are very polite. You don't want that officer to get angry at you. You want to be incredibly polite, unctuous even. And these are children because they want their, in the course of working on the documentary, Faith Ruffins, who's a curator at the Smithsonian, said what she told her children was that your job, if you're stopped by a police officer, is to live long enough for us to get to you.
Yes.
And
yes.
that is your job. So just keep that in mind. You want to live long enough for us to get to you.
Yes.
So you do whatever you have to do to make that happen. If you're stopped by the police.
I know you identified a clip of Black mothers and fathers preparing their children.
Yes.
For that experience.
I should tell you that this clip was sent to me by my daughter. Mm-hmm. My daughter has a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and it was heartbreaking that she mm-hmm. felt she had to talk to her 4-year-old and 6-year-old daughters about being in a car and what that meant if you were African American. Can you imagine? This is something you have to talk to 2 little girls, about. But she is the one that sent this to me.
Yes.
And it really broke my heart.
All right. So want to go ahead and cue this video? Whenever you're ready. I don't think we can hear it.
Why do you think I pulled you over?
What'd you do?
License and registration, please, ma'am.
Why do you think I pulled you over?
I don't know, tell me. When a police officer says something you don't, you're Black. You can't be looking at them saying, oh, I don't know, why don't you tell me? Well, that right there is giving them the license to pull you out of your car and physically harm you, because it will be done.
Don't get upset. Don't get sassy. Why did you pull me over? You don't have, I know how, just follow instructions and stay calm. Okay.
Do you think just being a police officer and pulling you over, regardless of if you feel you've done something or not, they should get your respect?
That's a tricky question.
The answer is yes.
Yes. If you got to go to your wallet to get your ID, say, can I go reach in my back pocket to get my ID out? You could do what I do, and I show them my hands. So when they're walking up, they see I don't have anything in my hands.
I'm Errol Sky Williams, and I have nothing that will harm you or hurt you.
And what's the next place you put your hands when you're driving or on the steering wheel with your hands out?
If at all possible, turn your phone on.
And call someone and put it on speaker.
But whatever you're doing, I want you to say what you're doing before you do it.
You don't write any statements.
Well, you have to write a statement.
You don't have to write anything. You're a minor. I'm responsible for you. No one can tell you anything else.
If it tells you to be quiet, be quiet. Do everything that you can to get back to me. I see it weighing on you, and I don't want it to weigh on you. I'm just worried about Donovan. I'm worried about him now.
Who are you guys talking about?
My nephew and her cousin. I don't want him to be shot. I don't want him to go to jail.
You guys, if you could say anything to police, what would you say? Learn about people. Learn about their problems.
Take some diversity training. I mean, it should be like at this point, like a monthly requirement. You know, there's really nothing at this point that they could do that would make me feel any safer with them without them just point blank, clearing them all out and starting all over from scratch.
So don't always assume that all of them are bad. What all you see on the news and in newspapers, and it keeps happening. It's just in a different way. It's like how people are like, you should forgive so-and-so, but they keep doing it to me. I forgave them, but they keep doing it to me. It gets harder and harder to forgive them.
Wow. All right. Thank you. Dr. Sorin, why don't we stop and take some questions at this time?
Okay.
All right. So let me see. All right. So let's see. First question is by Royce. It sounds like the North is or has been even more inhospitable to Blacks than the South. Even though the North was considered free, what still needs to happen in New York, in the Adirondacks, to freely welcome Blacks to travel, vacation, and own property?
I think, first of all, I think that there needs to be some conversations between the community and people of color that are in the Adirondacks and the police. And I think that those conversations need to happen all over the United States. I think the African Americans are as terrified of the police as the police are of African Americans, and we need to find a way to break that down. Mm-hmm. I think that bringing people to the Adirondacks and having good experiences would help people to say, this is a place I would like to go. I mean, I've spent time in the Adirondacks. I love the Adirondacks. I think it's a beautiful place to be in the summer. I have not personally had a bad experience in the Adirondacks. So I think if people get to come to the Adirondacks and have a good experience, they would consider vacationing there.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's while we're waiting on the other questions, there is recently, and I mean, there's been a lot of talk about refocused attention on the Confederate flags and Confederate symbols, most of which are on private property. Or
are there a lot of them in the Adirondacks?
There are enough that people of color and Black people driving through, it is noticeable. And I
mean, I think for African Americans, the Confederate flag is a symbol of, it's a hate symbol, and it's a symbol of racism. So, you know, I can't say that seeing Confederate flags is going to make African Americans feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the idea. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't understand the presence of Confederate flags. I've seen a couple around here as well. Mm-hmm. There seems to have been a resurgence in the last couple of years of the Confederate flag. Mm-hmm. It's also a battle flag. I don't quite understand the use of the Confederate battle flag, nor do I understand the use of a flag of a defeated state. Right. The Confederate flag. But I don't think African Americans feel comfortable when they see Confederate flags. So if there are a lot of Confederate flags in the Adirondacks, I don't think that's going to be a very welcoming.
Yes. Now, and that brings me to sort of the parallels between seeing No Blacks Allowed and Whites Only and the sundown towns that you write about in your book. And I was thinking through the parallels between the multiple Confederate symbols here and the No Blacks Allowed, Whites Only, and sundown towns, and look at what's happened to Ahmaud Arbery. Okay.
Yes, right.
Running while Black, or Floyd sitting in his car. I mean,
spaces in this country have been identified as white spaces, and people feel very proprietary, as if they can claim the space for only a particular group of people. And that's not the nature of a democracy. Yeah. The hounding and running down of Ahmaud Arbery is something I just don't understand. Mm-hmm. But this country has traditionally been divided into spaces by race. Mm-hmm. And those spaces that are white spaces are the spaces that have been dangerous for African Americans to traverse. Right. And if a space is perceived as a white space, as is much of upstate New York, you won't find African Americans visiting. You know, Cooperstown, I think, is perceived as a white space, and I think the reason that African Americans visit it is because of the Hall of Fame. Right. And I think they find that it's, you know, that because of baseball, which is a sport that has a lot of African American and a lot of Latino players, that they're comfortable coming to this community. Right. But it's not without, you know, the surrounding area is not without its a few Confederate flags as well.
All right. So I have another question here from an audience member. As a white person, what can I do if I see a Black person being pulled over? Woo.
It's interesting. This happened to Maxine Waters just last week. And she pulled over across the street, and she actually got out of her car. But, I think it's okay to just pull over and just sit there and watch, just to make sure that the Black person is okay.
Yeah.
Because the thing, I think all of these encounters with the police that we're seeing on videotape are the result of the phone.
Right.
I think these things are things that were happening before,
Yeah.
but nobody ever videoed them because we didn't have cell phones. And now that everybody's got a cell phone, you can see something wrong that's happening and videotape it. And that's really had as much of an impact, I think, as the automobile on African American life.
Right.
Because now we're starting to be able to preserve exactly what happened.
Yes.
And how George Floyd, I don't think without that videotape, they probably would not have been able to prosecute those officers.
And multiple angles, right? From multiple angles. And that's what's being used to really prosecute this case. That we do some of that work in our active bystander training. How do you make your presence known safely? And
right.
So that's an important part of that, is just making your presence known, especially if you are a white person and you are concerned with the safety of that Black person or person of color who is being stopped by the law enforcement.
Yes, and you do have to be careful because
Yes,
the
you
law
need to be
enforcement
careful.
officer could turn on you.
Exactly. So this is a significant book. I want to remind you that Driving While Black, I'm telling you, man, I really, Vitamin A, Zoom, but it's our only way. So this is a copy of the book. It is available, and I can tell you it is an excellent read. It is exceptionally well researched and seamlessly interwoven with Gretchen, Dr. Sorin's personal story. And please get the book. It's on sale at the Adirondack Experience website. The link to the website is you'll see it just below. I have another question here. How can I create, question by Shannon, how can I create safe spaces for my Black family members? And she's talking about I would think in the North Country, the Adirondacks, Northern New York, where it's predominantly white, rural, and isolated countrysides.
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you guarantee a safe space. I think you always carry a cell phone with you.
Yeah.
I think you make sure before you're visiting a particular place that you are comfortable, that you're going to be in the presence of a lot of people.
Yes.
That you're not going to be out in the wilderness by yourself.
Yeah.
And that you'll be within, that you're not in an area that's completely cell phone
Yes.
dead. You want to have
which is challenging, Gretchen, because
I know.
in the Adirondack, the cell service is spotty in places. And so I remember a colleague of mine, I said, we're going to organize a retreat for ADI when we are able to come together. And I wanted to use this lovely campsite, a writer's retreat. And she says, oh, great, we can cut off, we can no cell phone and so on. And I said, that really sounds like a white thing to say, because Black people, especially in rural isolated communities that are predominantly white, we always want to know that we have access to help. We can call someone. And so the idea of totally disconnecting, especially when you're traveling, is a scary thought. It is actually a scary thought. I just want to remind folks that you can, and ask you to please purchase, as well as you can purchase the book on Adirondack Experience website. Please purchase the book from Black-owned bookstores. And we've put several links below, as well as the Adirondack Experience of Black-owned bookstores. They are there, folks. They're all over, and you can purchase your book online. All right. So this
have a reliable car. Don't run out of gas. Have a reliable car that's not going to strand you someplace.
Yes.
I spent an entire winter driving back and forth to the Adirondacks once a week.
Yes.
The Adirondack Museum, then it was called, working on this tuberculosis exhibition. And having a reliable car is something you've really got to have in the Adirondacks, because there is, in the middle of winter, there's nobody around.
No one around. And I experienced some of that myself because I moved here on December 3rd. I experienced some of that myself driving up here, because at the time it was only the second time since I'd ever been beyond, I don't know, Syracuse and Albany. So I experienced some of that sort of fear and trepidation about driving that far as a Black female alone and not getting any service. So we have two more questions. I think we can take one more. Question by Jim. Could you expand on your statement that Black individuals are not comfortable in the wilderness?
In the documentary, one of the people that we interviewed said that he didn't like being near trees because trees are where Black people got lynched. And, I hadn't actually thought about it that way. I grew up in New Jersey. It's a different environment. It's not, I was never afraid to go camping. But this was a man from Colorado, actually, who said, going out into the wilderness, you might meet some crazy white people who would, lynch you. And maybe that sounds extreme to someone, but if that is the fear that people have, then you've got to legitimize that's how they're feeling. Mm-hmm. They don't know who they're going to encounter in the wilderness, in the wild, and that the wilderness is perceived as a white space. It's perceived as a place where white people are, not perceived as a place where Black people are. And so it's not perceived as a safe place to travel. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm not talking about any personal feelings. I'm talking about just the perception of the wilderness, the perception of trees, the perception of where people are lynched in isolated rural areas, right? When African Americans were dragged out to be lynched, most of them were, some of them, yes, were lynched in the middle of the town square, but most of them were lynched in rural private areas where nobody could see. Yeah. And that's just the perception of the history of rural areas and wilderness areas.
Which that perception also erases the First Nations existence on the land, right? So when you territorialize a space and the perception is it's whites only and violent to the racial other, then it erases the existence of people before whites were able to expand and colonize. Yeah. So the next question is, and I think it's going to be our last, it says, it's a question by Jen. Dr. Sorin, do you have or are you considering a study guide for the book? I know that you have the, with Ken Burns coming out, the documentary. But what about a study guide? Rick Burns, I apologize. So
we actually talked about that this week because the book has been adopted by some high school classes, and which was very surprising. It wasn't written for young readers. It was not written for high school, but some high schools have adopted it as a reading for 12th graders, 11th graders, 10th graders. Mm-hmm. And so we've been talking about perhaps doing a study guide.
Yes.
For the book. So yes, that's a possibility.
Awesome. All right, Dr. Sorin, we have 5 minutes left. Let's see if there is another question here. Okay, so this one is by, it says, wow, I am simply speechless and I feel clueless. How can I best support my daughter, her Black fiance, and my first grandchild? Yeah.
Oh, so that's a mixed race couple.
Yes.
So, I think I think the upcoming, first of all, my husband is Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
so, and we have mixed race children, and they're very well adjusted because they have faced racism, and so they know how to deal with it. And I think we've worked really hard to teach them about racial identity. The new African American Museum in Washington has a wonderful website that addresses the issue of race and racial identity. And that's a great place to start. There are also a lot of wonderful books out now that have Black characters as the protagonist, and that enable children to see themselves in books. I think that, having been to my daughter's friends are from all over the world and from all different colors and all different religions and different backgrounds. And it's wonderful to see this next generation and how much more integrated and empathetic they are. So congratulations. And
yes.
And get to reading. I think there's, and try that website. I think that website is really a terrific place to start.
Okay. I'm going to end with the last question, which really focuses on the documentary for the 3 minutes we have.
Mm-hmm. It
says, unfortunately, most Americans are aware of the Green Book through a Hollywood film. Mm-hmm. How will your documentary with Rick Burns, they got it correct, get a broad audience? And this is from Jackie Day.
Oh, from Jackie. It's on PBS on October 13th. There is a lot of collaboration between W.W. Norton, who's the publisher of the book, and the documentary. So we're working to promote it in both directions, documentary and film together, documentary, film, and book together, so that people will watch it.
Mm-hmm. So it becomes sort of a series then.
Exactly.
Extremely informative, yes. So someone asked finally, will there, and I guess this is a question for ADI, mentioned bystander training. On August 1st, we'll be publishing our resources. So you'll have access to active bystander information. But we will launch our active bystander training on August 1st, and you can enroll for that training. Okay, just to let you know. And that's from Joe Shoemaker. Hi, Joe. All right. So I want to thank you, Dr. Gretchen. I keep calling you Dr. Sorin. And you know what that is? It's about, I'm Jamaican, so we're very formal. So I keep reverting to the Dr. Sorin. So yeah. So Dr. Sorin, once again, we want to remind our viewers that Dr. Sorin's book is available for purchase. Here it is, at the Adirondack Experience website, and we have added a link to the chat box. Please pick up your copy of the book. You can also get a copy of the book from Black-owned bookstores. We've listed many of them, several of them in the chat. Next, part 2 of Driving While Black is going to be on July 30th. And Clifton Harcum, who is a diversity officer for SUNY Potsdam, will be moderating a discussion of people who live in the North Country and the Adirondack Black people who have had experiences while driving while Black, and they want to discuss that. Then we'll wrap up the part 3 of Driving While Black with Dr. Boyd. Dr. Boyd is a former police officer in Chicago, and he's now a professor, and his research, sociologist, his research focuses on community policing and working with different police groups and especially predominantly white rural communities about what it means to protect and serve. And so I want to thank you. On Monday, the ADI's, the 4th installment of the Anti-Racism 101 will occur at 6 o'clock. All of our events, whether it's Thursday, the Black Experience, or Anti-Racism 101 is at 6 o'clock. And so on Monday, you will hear from white anti-racist accomplices speak truth to white power. Don't miss that. Okay, it's at 6 o'clock. You should be able to register today. All right. So, and you'll find more information. We'll save a copy of this video on both the Adirondack Experience Museum website and on the ADI website under resources. I want to thank who the collaboration has been seamless and wonderful and very pertinent and relevant to now, and building sustainable responses and sustainable ways to talk about making the region more welcoming and inclusive to all New Yorkers and all visitors. Also, I want to thank ANCA, my ANCA family, the Adirondack North Country Association, for making this possible in every way. I want to thank, not even lastly, but the entire core team of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. 12 members strong. These people are leaders in their community, but they're leaders in the anti-racism movement. And I want to thank them immensely for what they're doing in the community now. I want to thank other members of the community who have decided that they're no longer going to stay silent. They're going to listen in. They're going to be part of action. And so thank you for today. Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you for the work you're doing. This is a powerful, powerful narrative. Your story is included in there. The research is well done. And I thank you for doing this for us and for communities that need it. Okay, you have a great day, and thank you for your time. Bye.